Have you ever stared at something so ordinary, only to feel an unshakable chill run down your spine? This is one of those stories, a chilling account that begins with a gravestone no one remembers, but holds a secret that will haunt you long after this video ends. Some stories are better left untold, but not this one. What you are about to hear is not just a story, it's a haunting truth that has remained buried for decades. A truth tied to this unmarked gravestone and a young man's terrifying encounter with something beyond comprehension. A flashback begins. A young man, barely in his 20s, sits motionless before the gravestone, his face pale and hollow. The narrator continues. For days he sat there unblinking, unflinching, as if trapped in some invisible web. The townsfolk whispered about him, calling him cursed, warning each other to stay away. But no one dared approach him, no one but her. The screen transitions to the elderly woman gripping her wooden cane, her silhouette cutting through the mist like a ghostly figure. Her cautious steps echo unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent graveyard. As she moves closer to the gravestone, the camera captures her expression, half curiosity, half fear. She had seen things before, the narrator intones, things that most people dismiss as shadows or tricks of the mind. But this was different. This gravestone felt alive. Its very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the air. As the woman steps within arm's length of the young man, the temperature seems to drop further. Her breath becomes visible, hanging in the cold air like a ghostly plume. She hesitates before asking in a trembling voice, "Young man, what are you doing here?" "I'm talking to my fiancée. She's here, with me, even if no one else can see her." A cold shiver runs down the viewer's spine as the narrator adds. What the elderly woman didn't realize was that this encounter would awaken something sinister, something tied not just to the gravestone, but to the past, the young man, and herself. We dive deeper into this chilling tale, a warning. Some stories, like this one, challenge our understanding of reality. If you're ready to uncover the truth behind the Forgotten Gravestone, subscribe to Sinister Stories, hit the bell, and prepare yourself. Some secrets should never be unearthed. The story plunges into the eerie surroundings of the cemetery, a place that feels forgotten by time itself. The camera pans over the uneven terrain, revealing gravestones leaning at unnatural angles, their inscriptions eroded by decades of wind and rain. The sky is a muted gray, and a dense fog weaves through the tall, skeletal trees, their twisted branches clawing at the heavens like bony fingers. The air feels oppressive, as if it holds its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to emerge from the shadows. It's said that the dead rest in peace, but some cemeteries tell a different story. This one, on the outskirts of a desolate town, has been abandoned for years. Locals avoid it, claiming it's cursed, a place where even the most devout prayers go unanswered. It's here, amidst the crumbling graves and the suffocating silence, that the story begins. A slow zoom focuses on a particular corner of the cemetery, where the gravestones are clustered like mourners at a funeral. One stone stands out, or rather, it tries not to. Unlike the others, it bears no name, no dates, no symbols. Its surface is unnaturally smooth, devoid of moss or lichen, as if the passage of time has refused to touch it. The camera lingers, capturing a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the ground around it, as if the earth itself recoils from the gravestone. This gravestone has no name, no history, yet it exudes a presence. Those who venture too close report feeling an unbearable weight in their chest, as though something unseen is watching, waiting. The camera shifts to the young man, seated before the gravestone. His clothes are disheveled, his hands trembling as he clutches a crude iron bracelet, its edges rough and jagged as if forged in haste. His gaze is fixed on the gravestone, his lips moving ever so slightly, whispering words that the wind seems eager to carry away before they can be understood. The sound design deepens the tension. Faint whispers, too soft to discern, swirl in the air, mingling with the distant caw of a lone crow. A low, almost imperceptible hum grows steadily louder, as if resonating from the gravestone itself. The camera captures the elderly woman standing at a distance, her silhouette framed by the encroaching fog. She watches the young man intently, her cane planted firmly in the soft earth. She had passed by this cemetery countless times in her life, but something about this day was different. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. And that boy seemed like he belonged to the cemetery more than the living world. As the woman takes her first step toward the gravestone, the atmosphere shifts. The wind stills, the whispers vanish, and the oppressive silence becomes deafening. Each step she takes feels wrong, like she's intruding on sacred, forbidden ground. The camera captures the unease in her movements as she approaches the young man, her every instinct screaming for her to turn back. Yet, something compels her to continue, as if the gravestone itself is beckoning her forward. She halts a few feet away, her eyes darting nervously to the gravestone. For a brief moment, she swears she sees movement, a shadow shifting across its smooth surface. She blinks, and it's gone. Her hand tightens around the cane as she clears her throat, breaking the silence. "Young man, why are you here?" The young man doesn't respond at first. His head tilts slightly, as if listening to something only he can hear. When he finally speaks, his voice is low, almost a whisper. "She's here. She's always been here." He points to the gravestone, his hand trembling, and for a moment, the camera catches the faint outline of something etched into the stone, marks that seem to shift and disappear under the fog's touch. The woman didn't know it then, but her decision to approach that gravestone would uncover horrors buried deeper than the dead themselves. For some gravestones don't mark where a body rests, they mark where nightmares begin. The cemetery had always been silent, but this silence felt different. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the presence of something waiting, unseen, in the stillness. The elderly woman stood just a few feet from the young man, her breath visible in the cold air. She tried to dismiss the unnatural chill as a trick of the weather, but the sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, yet her curiosity kept her rooted in place. The young man finally looked up, his hollow eyes locking with hers. His face was pale, the shadows under his eyes so dark they seemed to sink into his skull. He broke the heavy silence with a single sentence. "I've been talking to her." His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the quiet like a scream. The woman's gaze darted to the gravestone, its blank surface now seeming to pulse faintly, as if alive. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling against the weight of the moment. "My fiancée," he replied, pointing to the gravestone. The woman's stomach tightened. She glanced at the gravestone again, noticing something she hadn't before, thin, jagged scratches at its edges. They looked too deliberate to be the work of nature, yet too erratic to be human. They seemed to form symbols, but no pattern made sense. She leaned closer, squinting in the dim light, when she heard it for the first time. A faint, guttural sound, almost like breathing. She froze, her ears straining. It was barely audible, blending with the soft rustle of leaves, but it was there. The young man didn't seem to notice, his attention fixated on the gravestone. "She answers me sometimes," he murmured. "Not with words. Not anymore." The woman took a step back, her hand tightening around her cane. Her heart pounded as her mind raced to rationalize what she was hearing. She opened her mouth to speak, but then it happened, a sharp, metallic screech, like nails dragged across stone. It came from the gravestone itself. The sound was piercing, unnatural, and sent an icy chill down her spine. The young man didn't flinch, as if it were nothing new to him. Instead, he smiled faintly, a haunting expression that sent waves of unease through her. "She's happy you're here," he said, his voice carrying a chilling calm. The woman felt the overwhelming urge to leave, yet something rooted her to the spot. She couldn't look away from the gravestone, now bathed in an unearthly glow that seemed to seep from within its cracks. The air around it grew colder, and the faint whispers began again, louder this time. They were fragmented, overlapping voices that spoke no language she recognized. The young man's breathing grew heavier, his body swaying slightly as though drawn closer to the gravestone by an invisible force. "Do you hear them?" he asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. The woman nodded, her voice failing her. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, as if on cue, the air grew dense, suffocating. The woman stumbled back, her cane slipping in the soft earth, as a shadow passed over her. She looked up, expecting to see a bird or a cloud, but the sky was empty. Her gaze fell back to the gravestone. For the briefest moment, she saw something impossible. A face, distorted and anguished, pressed against the stone's surface as if trapped inside. It was gone in an instant, leaving her questioning whether she had imagined it. "She's still here," the young man whispered, his voice filled with a strange reverence. "She doesn't want me to leave, and now, she doesn't want you to leave either." The woman's pulse raced as the ground beneath her feet trembled faintly, as if the earth itself was warning her to flee. She took a step back, her trembling hand reaching for the crucifix around her neck. But the young man didn't move. He remained seated, staring at the gravestone with an unsettling calm. What the woman didn't yet understand was that the gravestone wasn't just a marker for the dead, it was a doorway. a tether between two worlds where the living weren't welcome. And now she had been noticed. The woman's breath hitched as she stood frozen in the icy grip of fear. Her rational mind screamed for her to leave, to abandon this cursed place and the unsettling young man who seemed so connected to the unnatural events unfolding around the gravestone. Yet a deeper curiosity, tinged with dread, kept her rooted in place. It was as though the gravestone itself exerted a pull, an invisible force that demanded she stay and uncover its dark secrets. "You shouldn't be here," the young man muttered suddenly, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. His gaze was still fixed on the gravestone, but his tone carried an ominous warning. "She doesn't like strangers, but she's curious about you." The woman's hand tightened on her cane as she steadied herself. "What do you mean? Who doesn't like strangers?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. She needed answers, even as the weight of the air around her seemed to press down harder. The young man turned to her for the first time, his hollow eyes filled with a strange mix of sorrow and fear. "My fiancée," he said, nodding toward the gravestone. "She's still here. She never left." The woman's stomach churned as she felt the temperature drop even further. Her eyes darted to the gravestone, its smooth surface now glistening faintly as if damp. She thought she saw movement, a ripple across the stone like disturbed water, but when she blinked, it was gone. "That's impossible," she whispered, trying to inject reason into the conversation. "She passed away, you said so yourself. This is just a gravestone. Nothing more." The young man let out a hollow laugh, devoid of humor. "That's what I thought too. But then I heard her. I felt her. She's here, trapped waiting. And now she wants to know you." The woman's grip on her cane tightened as a sharp gust of wind howled through the cemetery, carrying with it the faintest sound of laughter, soft, feminine, but deeply unsettling. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Was that the wind? She thought, trying to rationalize. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The young man rose slowly, his movements almost mechanical, as if compelled by an unseen force. He pointed to the gravestone, his hand shaking. "She wants you to see it. She wants you to understand." The woman's instincts screamed at her to leave, to turn and run as far as her legs could carry her. But something stopped her. The flicker of emotion in the young man's face, the possibility that his pain might be real, and the nagging feeling that if she walked away now, she'd never escape the questions clawing at her mind. With trembling steps, she moved closer to the gravestone, her cane sinking slightly into the damp earth. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her like a chorus of disembodied voices. They were chaotic, overlapping, but one word seemed to cut through the noise: "Stay." The woman hesitated, her pulse racing. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. If she stayed, if she allowed herself to become part of whatever dark force lingered here, there might be no turning back. But if she left, would she ever find peace knowing she had walked away from something so profoundly unnatural? "What happens if I don't?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the whispers. The young man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "She doesn't take rejection well," he said simply. His words hung in the air, a chilling warning that sent shivers down her spine. Summoning all her courage, the woman leaned closer to the gravestone, her fingers brushing against its cold, smooth surface. The moment she touched it, the world seemed to shift. The air grew impossibly dense, the whispers became deafening, and a sharp, searing pain shot through her hand. She yanked it back, staring in horror at the faint outline of a handprint burned into her palm. The young man stepped back, his face pale with terror. "It's too late now," he muttered, his voice trembling. "She knows you're here." In that moment, the woman faced a choice: walk away from the gravestone and live with the knowledge that she'd been marked by something beyond comprehension, or stay and confront the darkness that had claimed the young man, his fiancée, and perhaps countless others before them. What would you do if faced with the unknown? The air was electric, vibrating with an unseen energy that made every breath feel heavy, oppressive. The woman stood frozen, her eyes locked on the gravestone, its surface now alive with an unearthly glow that pulsed in sync with her racing heartbeat. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, overlapping voices clawing at her sanity. Some were soft and pleading, others sharp and accusatory, their words indistinct but dripping with malice. She clutched her cane tightly, its wooden grip her only anchor in the spiraling chaos. The young man moved closer to the gravestone, as if drawn by an invisible force. His expression was distant, entranced, his lips murmuring something she couldn't quite make out. As he reached toward the gravestone, the woman's instinct screamed to stop him, but fear kept her rooted in place. The moment his fingers touched the stone, the world around them seemed to explode. The cemetery was plunged into darkness, the last remnants of daylight snuffed out as though a great shadow had swallowed the sun. The air grew icy, and a high-pitched hum filled the silence, vibrating deep in her chest. Then, without warning, the gravestone cracked, a jagged line splitting its smooth surface. From the fissure seeped a thick, black mist, writhing and twisting as though alive. The young man gasped, stumbling backward. His eyes widened in terror as the mist began to take shape. It coalesced into a figure, a woman, ethereal and otherworldly, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her face was pale, her features sharp and hauntingly beautiful, but her eyes were empty voids, black and endless, pulling everything into their abyss. "She's here," the young man whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and dread. The woman's instinct was to run, to flee this unholy manifestation, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped, caught in the gaze of the apparition's void-like eyes. The ghostly figure turned toward her, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. The whispers returned, louder now, and this time she could understand them. "Stay with us," they hissed. "Don't leave. You belong here." The apparition reached out, its hand elongated and skeletal, its fingers tapering into sharp, blackened claws. The woman recoiled as the temperature plummeted further, frost forming on the grass and gravestones around her. She felt an invisible pressure pushing against her chest, suffocating her, as the misty figure stepped closer. The young man dropped to his knees, his voice breaking into sobs. "I told you she's still here. She doesn't let go. She never lets go." His words were frantic, his body trembling violently. The apparition's voice, soft and haunting, echoed through the air. "Why did you come here?" it asked, its tone filled with sorrow and menace. The woman tried to answer, but her throat tightened, and the words wouldn't come. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her, before its gaze shifted to the young man. "You promised," it whispered, its voice sharper now, edged with anger. "You said you wouldn't leave me." The young man screamed, his hands clawing at his face as though trying to block out the sound. The woman finally found her voice, though it was weak and trembling. "What are you? Why are you here?" The apparition turned back to her, its empty eyes boring into her soul. "I am what remains," it said cryptically. "Bound by love, by betrayal, by the lies etched into this stone." The gravestone began to pulse again, the glow intensifying as the fissure widened. The whispers grew deafening, the voices screaming in a cacophony of rage and despair. The woman fell to her knees, her hands covering her ears, but the sound penetrated her very being. She felt the ground beneath her tremble violently, as though the cemetery itself was coming alive. Suddenly, the apparition lunged toward the young man, its clawed hand plunging into his chest. He let out a blood-curdling scream as the mist enveloped him, wrapping around his body like constricting vines. His eyes rolled back, and his body convulsed as the entity seemed to siphon the very life from him. The woman could only watch in horror, unable to move, as the mist dragged the young man toward the gravestone. His screams echoed through the cemetery, growing fainter as his body was pulled into the fissure. Within seconds, he was gone, his presence erased as though he had never existed. The apparition turned back to the woman, its form now more solid, its features sharper and more menacing. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "Now you belong to the stone." The gravestone began to crack further, and the mist surged toward the woman, wrapping around her legs and pulling her closer. She screamed, fighting with every ounce of strength she had, but the force was too strong. Her cane splintered as she clawed at the ground, her fingers digging into the earth. What happens when you awaken something that should have been left undisturbed? For the woman, this was only the beginning, and as she was dragged closer to the gravestone, she realized the horrifying truth. There are some places where even the living cannot escape the grip of the dead. The air was thick with dread, every breath feeling like it was stolen from the woman's chest. Her hands trembled as she clawed at the ground, desperate to resist the pull of the gravestone. The black mist coiling around her legs felt alive, its touch icy and suffocating. She could feel the weight of countless eyes watching her from the darkness, though the cemetery was empty, or so it seemed. The whispers now carried a new tone, something almost celebratory, as if the unseen forces reveled in her impending doom. The apparition loomed over her, its hollow, void-like eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to pierce her very soul. Its skeletal hand reached out again, the claws gleaming unnaturally in the dim, flickering glow emanating from the gravestone. "You don't understand," it whispered, its voice a chilling mix of sorrow and malice. This was never about him. It was always about you. The woman's mind reeled. What do you mean? She gasped, her voice barely audible over the deafening hum that now emanated from the gravestone. The apparition tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. The stone chooses, it said, the words heavy with finality. It binds itself to those it marks. The boy was never meant to be here. But you belong. As the words sank in, a series of fragmented visions began to flood the woman's mind. She saw flashes of the gravestone in different eras, each time, a different figure standing before it, their faces twisted in terror as the mist claimed them. She realized with mounting horror that this was no ordinary gravestone. It was a tether, a gateway to something far darker, something beyond human comprehension. Why me? She cried out, her voice trembling with a mix of defiance and desperation. The apparition leaned closer, its skeletal face mere inches from hers. Because you are the final piece, it hissed. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, the earth splitting into a gaping chasm that seemed to stretch into infinite darkness. The mist surged downward, dragging her with it, and for a moment, she felt weightless, suspended in a void. Then, with a deafening roar, she was plunged into an otherworldly realm. The world around her was a nightmare made real. Shadows twisted and writhed like living creatures, their forms indistinct but menacing. The air was thick with an acrid metallic scent, and an unnatural red glow pulsed from an unseen source. All around her were whispers, no longer fragmented, but clear and deliberate. They spoke of despair, betrayal, and eternal torment. In the distance, she saw them, figures trapped in the mist, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Each figure was tethered to the ground by chains made of the same black mist, their bodies writhing as if caught in a perpetual struggle. The young man was among them, his hollow eyes staring blankly ahead, his voice joining the chorus of despair. The woman turned, searching for a way out, but there was none. The apparition appeared before her once more, its form now fully solid, radiating an aura of malice so intense it was almost tangible. You ask why, it said, its voice echoing with a sinister resonance. Because the stone demands balance. For every soul it takes, it must return one, and you have been chosen to take my place. The realization hit her like a blow. The apparition wasn't merely a ghost, it was a prisoner, bound to the gravestone, serving as its guardian and collector. And now it was her turn. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I won't do this. I won't stay. The apparition let out a chilling laugh, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. You don't have a choice, it said. No one ever does. The mist surged forward, wrapping around her torso and pulling her closer to the gravestone, now glowing brighter than ever. She screamed, the sound tearing through the oppressive air, but it was no use. The gravestone's pull was irresistible, its cracks widening to reveal a swirling abyss of red and black. In a final act of defiance, the woman reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, silver crucifix. She pressed it against the mist, and for a brief moment, the apparition recoiled, its form flickering violently. The whispers grew louder, angrier, but the mist's grip loosened just enough for her to break free. She stumbled backward, her breathing ragged as the gravestone's glow began to fade. The apparition let out a shriek of fury, its form dissolving into the mist as it was sucked back into the stone. The whispers quieted, the cemetery falling into an eerie silence once more. But the victory was hollow. The woman's body trembled as she looked down at her hands. The faint outline of black mist still clung to her skin, and her reflection in a nearby puddle showed eyes that weren't entirely her own. She realized the truth. Though she had escaped, a part of her now belonged to the gravestone, and it would never let her go completely. She thought she had won, that she had escaped the stone's grasp. But some victories come at a cost, and some battles never truly end. The cemetery was eerily quiet, as though the world itself had paused to witness the aftermath. The woman stumbled away from the gravestone, her legs trembling, her breath shallow. The once vibrant glow of the gravestone had faded, but the air still felt heavy, charged with a sinister energy. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the apparition re-emerge from the mist, but the gravestone stood silent, its smooth surface betraying no hint of the horror it had just unleashed. Her heart raced as she tried to rationalize what had happened. The whispers, the apparition, the mist, they couldn't have been real. And yet, the searing pain in her hand told a different story. She looked down to see the faint, blackened outline of the gravestone etched into her palm, as though branded by the entity itself. The mark pulsed faintly, like a second heartbeat, sending waves of cold through her veins. The woman's mind reeled as she tried to piece together the fragmented events. What had the apparition meant when it said she was chosen? Why did the gravestone feel alive, as though it had a will of its own? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that her encounter with the supernatural wasn't over. It had only just begun. She turned her gaze to the horizon, where the cemetery's iron gates loomed in the distance. They seemed impossibly far, shrouded in a thickening fog that clung to the ground like a living entity. Every step toward them felt like a battle, her body weighed down by an invisible force. The whispers had stopped, but their absence was almost worse. The silence felt oppressive, pregnant with the promise of something worse yet to come. As she neared the gates, she froze. A figure stood in the mist, its outline barely visible in the pale light of the moon. Her breath hitched as she recognized the silhouette. It was the young man. But something about him was wrong. His body seemed too still, too rigid, and his eyes glowed faintly with the same unnatural light she had seen emanating from the gravestone. "You can't leave," he said, his voice hollow and devoid of emotion. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. The woman gripped her broken cane like a weapon, her knuckles white. "Stay away," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her fear. The young man tilted his head, his movements slow and unnatural, as though controlled by an unseen force. "You belong to it now," he said. "Just like me. Just like all of us." Behind him, more figures began to emerge from the mist, shadowy, indistinct, their faces blank slates of pale light. They moved in unison, their footsteps eerily silent, as though they weren't fully part of this world. The woman backed away, her heart pounding as she realized they were closing in, forming a circle around her. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, though the weight of their presence said otherwise. The young man stepped closer, his glowing eyes fixed on hers. "It doesn't matter if you believe," he said. "The gravestone chose you. You carry its mark. You can never escape." The woman's back hit the cemetery gates, their cold iron biting into her skin. She fumbled with the latch, her hands trembling, but it wouldn't budge. The figures drew closer, their hollow gazes boring into her, and the whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, until they filled her mind with an unbearable cacophony. Just as the figures reached her, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the figures froze, and the young man's expression changed. For a moment, she saw a flicker of humanity in his glowing eyes, a plea for help that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, the figures dissolved into the mist, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. She collapsed to the ground, her body trembling, her mind racing. The cemetery was still once more, but she knew better than to believe she was safe. The mark on her hand burned faintly, a constant reminder of the gravestone's claim on her. She thought she had escaped, but the gravestone's reach extended far beyond the cemetery. It wasn't just a marker for the dead, it was a doorway, a tether, a curse. And now she was part of it. Some gravestones mark the end of life. Others mark the beginning of something much darker. And once you've been chosen, there's no turning back. The woman sat in her dimly lit living room, her eyes fixed on the flickering flame of a single candle. The shadows it cast danced across the walls, twisting and bending into shapes that felt unsettlingly familiar, almost as if they were alive. The faint hum of the gravestone's whispers lingered in the back of her mind, a haunting echo she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. She rubbed her palm absent-mindedly, feeling the raised, blackened scar that now marked her, a grim reminder of the night that had forever altered her reality. The world outside her window was still. The usual noises of the night, crickets chirping, distant cars humming, were absent. It was as if the universe itself had shifted, pulling her into a reality just slightly askew from the one she once knew. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Every explanation sounded absurd, even to her. Yet, the fear that had seeped into her very bones told her it was all real. Terrifyingly, unavoidably real. What was it? She whispered to herself, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. The gravestone, the mist, the faces in the shadows, all of it had left an indelible mark not only on her body, but on her soul. She had faced something ancient, something that defied explanation, and though she had walked away, she knew she hadn't escaped. Her eyes darted toward the window, drawn to a subtle movement outside. She froze, her heart pounding, as she caught a glimpse of a shadow slipping across her yard. It was too quick, too fluid to belong to anything natural. She rose slowly, her cane gripped tightly in her hand. Each step toward the window felt heavier, her body weighed down by an invisible force. As she pulled back the curtain, the yard was empty. The wind rustled the trees, but there was no sign of anyone or anything there. Yet, the sense of being watched persisted, prickling at the back of her neck. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned away, but the feeling followed her. It was as though the very air around her had eyes, watching, waiting. The mark on her palm began to burn faintly, pulling her attention to it. The scar seemed darker than before, the edges spreading ever so slightly. She clenched her fist, as if trying to hide it from herself, but the pain didn't stop. Instead, it grew, radiating up her arm in sharp, icy waves. She stumbled to the couch, clutching her wrist, tears welling in her eyes as the whispers began again, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. They weren't just whispers this time. They were words. Clear, chilling words. You are ours now. You cannot escape. The candle's flame flickered violently, casting the room into momentary darkness. When it steadied, the shadows on the walls had changed. They no longer danced at random. They had formed shapes, figures. The woman's breath hitched as she recognized them. The young man, his hollow eyes staring back at her. The ghostly figures from the cemetery, their blank faces twisted in torment. And then the apparition itself, its void-like eyes seeming to pierce through the wall and into her very being. Her heart raced as the shadows began to move, stepping closer to her, their presence as oppressive as the night she had faced the gravestone. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows closed in, and the whispers grew deafening, forming a chorus of despair. You belong to us, they said in unison, their voices reverberating through the room. The flame went out completely, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling, but the screen remained black. A chill ran down her spine as she felt a presence behind her, cold, overwhelming, inescapable. She turned slowly, and there it was. The apparition, its skeletal hand reaching for her. Its voice was soft, almost gentle, as it whispered, "You should never have come." She thought she could move on, that she could outrun the gravestone's curse. But some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some choices bind us to a darkness that watches, waits, and never forgets. Another soul will come, drawn by the gravestone's pull. The cycle continues, for the gravestone does not rest. And neither do the shadows it leaves behind. A faint whisper lingers as the screen fades to black. Stay with us,